Hey y'all, Leela with mskisskreations. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be showing you how I created this glittered distress sunflower tumbler. Like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including some direct links and coupon codes. And if you don't know, you can visit my website, mskisskreations, to purchase any tumbler that I've created. And I also sell UV DTF cup wraps and decals. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. Today I'm using a 20-ounce thick stainless steel tumbler. I purchased this tumbler from Makerflow Crafts. I'm going to prep this tumbler by using an 80 grit sanding block, and I'm going to sand all around the tumbler to include the top rim and the bottom. Once I'm finished sanding, I'm going to place that tumbler arm back into the tumbler and then wipe my tumbler down with 91% alcohol. You wanna make sure you're using at least 91% alcohol, because if you use anything less than that, you're going to risk your epoxy repelling or creating fish eyes around your tumbler. Once the alcohol is dry on my tumbler, I'm now going to apply my paint to the tumbler. I am using Adhesive Apothecary Citrine. This is a 3-in-1. This is a paint, primer, and adhesive. I am using my Wet n Wild makeup brush to apply this paint. Once I've added the paint to the tumbler, I'm taking Glitter Heartco's Ray of Sunshine Yellow, this beautiful bright yellow, and I'm going to place that all around my tumbler. All of these will be linked in my description below with some coupon codes. I really enjoy these Adhesive Apothecary colors because, one, it is so hot in Florida and I can't stand going outside and spray painting my tumblers and coming back just soaking wet from sweat. So I'm able to add these paints to the tumbler, and I'm able to not only prime my tumbler, not only get a full coated color on my tumbler, but also use these paints as an adhesive. Now this yellow is a lighter color, so I like to put a thicker coat of the paint on the tumbler just so you're not able to see through that color. One tip I do have with using these paints is when you're finished using these brushes after you place the glitter, make sure you wash these paint brushes immediately or it will dry. These paints have that adhesive in there and it will dry that paintbrush, make it crusty, rusty, and you won't be able to use that brush again. And now for my favorite part of the tumbler process, adding the glitter to the tumbler. This glitter was so pretty underneath that yellow paint. It made that glitter pop even more, and I chose to use only one color. If you want, you can use 2 or 3 colors, make an ombre, make your tumbler whichever way you like to make it, but I wanted to keep it very simple for my beginners. Once I finish adding my glitter to my tumbler, I take my tumbler outside and I spray it with my Krylon Crystal Clear acrylic coating. You can use any brand of acrylic coating you have on hand, and you can also use clear spray paint. Like I said, I do this immediately after I place my glitter on my tumbler, and I let my tumbler dry for about 25 to 30 minutes before moving on to the next step. You want to make sure this coating is completely dried, and you want to make sure that Adhesive Apothecary paint is completely dried under the glitter before applying your epoxy. And once my tumbler was dried, I went in with my coat of epoxy. I am using my Flynn Sister Supply Shop epoxy. You can find her website and coupon code linked in my description below. I am using a total of 40 mLs of epoxy. That's 20 mLs part A and 20 mLs part B. The reason why I choose 40 is because I have a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I times 20 by 2, and that's 40, so I use 40 mLs of epoxy. I will say with a finer glitter, sometimes I don't use as much epoxy as 40 mLs, but I always like to have at least some left over than not have enough epoxy. You just want to make sure that this epoxy is placed on the tumbler and that all of the glitter on this tumbler is completely covered with epoxy. If you do happen to have a too thin of coat of epoxy, meaning if the glitter is still bumpy underneath the epoxy, that is okay. Just let your epoxy cure, air dry, and then go in with another thin coat of epoxy. I would recommend probably about 10 mLs of epoxy for your second coat, and then you can move on with designing your tumbler over that epoxy. I know that it was a lot, but I always get a lot of questions in reference to how much epoxy and why I use the amount of epoxy I use on these tumblers. So this coat that you're seeing now is a total of 40 mLs of epoxy. That's 20 mLs part A and 20 mLs part B. After I apply my epoxy, I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 4 hours, and then I let my tumbler air dry or air cure for another 20 hours or so. And then we'll move on to the next step. Now that my epoxy is cured, I take my X-Acto knife and I trim around the rim of my tumbler, just getting rid of some of that excess epoxy. And then I take my sanding block and I sand around the rim, and I also sand the tiniest bit of the top to expose the smallest bit of stainless steel. So whenever we add that final coat of epoxy, there's a nice seal at the top of the tumbler. And the sanding block is a 180 grit sanding block. Anytime you sand a tumbler, you want to make sure you follow up with some 91% alcohol just to remove any of that sanding dust or any of those excess oils that I may have added to the tumbler. The next step is to add the distressed effect to the tumbler. The way you add the distressed effect is using Elmer's glue, some acrylic paint, I have some paintbrush, and a painter's tray. I've been making distressed tumblers for about 5 years now, and I found that watering down your acrylic paint allows your tumbler to distress more. So I add some water to my paint, I stir it with a popsicle stick, and then I add more water. The consistency that I'm looking for is when I add that paintbrush into that acrylic paint, I want to make sure it drips some to have more of a watered down paint than a thicker paint. Then I take my Elmer's glue and I add a bunch of Elmer's glue to the tumbler. You want to really coat this tumbler with the Elmer's glue. I found that applying a lot of Elmer's glue to the tumbler allows that distressed look to really take over the entire cup. If you feel like you've added too much, add a little bit more. You'll see I'm adding all of this glue to the tumbler, and then I'm reapplying that glue and I'm adding new glue over the glue I've already applied. So you want to make sure it's really, really thick. When you have the Elmer's glue applied to the tumbler, you want to make sure that it's just all over the tumbler. If you miss a little spots, that's okay, because this is a distressed tumbler. It's not made to look perfect, and it doesn't have to be evenly distributed throughout the tumbler. So if you have some areas that it's like really thick and then some areas that are really thin, that's okay. It's going to give that nice distressed look. So while that while that glue is still wet, you're going to take your paint and paint right over the wet glue. Don't wait for your glue to dry at all. You don't have to wait 10 minutes. You don't have to do any math. Apply that paint right over that glue, and it's going to feel weird and like really, really glossy, but that is okay. Now that you have your glue and your paint mixture on your tumbler, you're going to take a heat gun and apply heat to the tumbler. This is going to create that crackle effect or that distressed look, and you want to make sure you're not overheating your tumbler, but you're applying enough heat where you see it's starting to crack. So if you see those cracks starting to form, that is what you want. If you apply too much heat, your paint and your glue is going to bubble up and it's not going to look nice. But the good thing about that, an easy way to fix, is just take that bubble area off and scrape it, and it's going to just go with the tumbler. So the best things about these cups is really this process you can't mess up, because it's a distressed tumbler and it's made to look messed up. So if you mess up on some areas, it's just going to blend with the tumbler more than if you would mess up on another tumbler. So make sure you are careful with touching your tumbler, because this is heat applied to stainless steel and it is going to get really hot. I try to apply a lot of heat to this tumbler because I not only want to create that crackle or distress look, but I also want to dry that glue in the paint so it is completely dried on the tumbler. And now that your paint and glue's on the tumbler, you have your distress look. Now we are going to manipulate that distress look. I'm taking some new paper towels and I'm cutting my paper towels into thirds just to save on material. I'm going to dip the paper towel into a cup of water. It doesn't matter if it's cold, hot, room temp. I just have room temp. And then I am going to distress this tumbler. If you notice, I do have a sponge now, and I prefer to distress a tumbler with a rag because it has more of a rough surface. But all I had on hand tonight was a paper towel and one of the sponge brushes to help me out with that. The rougher the surface, the easier it is to distress your tumbler and to remove some of that paint. I find that it's easier to remove the paint sooner than later, so I do this right after I apply my heat to the tumbler. I allow my tumbler to cool down from the heat gun, and then I start distressing. So I wait about 5 to 10 minutes after I've heated up my tumbler just to make sure it's completely cooled down, and then I start this distressing part of the tumbler. If you're using a rag, make sure that rag is completely cleaned and it has no previous oils on those rags, because you risk the chance of applying that rag to your tumbler and then transferring those oils from the rag to the tumbler, and your next coat of epoxy will repel. I also know that some people use 91% alcohol. That has never worked for me. I've always just done it this way. You have to put your elbow into this and really wipe away, but I just find that using water is the easiest for me. But using a rough rag or even a sponge, a brand new sponge from your kitchen sink, it might be even easier than using a brand new paper towel. You really just wipe away the areas that you feel that needs to be distressed. There's really no rhyme or reason or secret to this part, but you just make your tumbler whichever way you want to make it. If you want to add less distress, you can, or more distress, or if you want to skip this step completely and just keep the paint on the tumbler how the heat gun made it, then you can always do that as well. But I always like some glitter peeking through the tumbler. Once you're finished with distressing your tumbler, you want to go in with your next coat of epoxy just to seal in that paint and glue. Before you start with your next coat of epoxy, you want to make sure that your glue and paint are completely dried. So if you feel the need to leave your tumbler out for another hour before epoxying, then that might be a good idea. For this coat of epoxy, I only use 10 mLs of epoxy. That's 5 mLs part A and 5 mLs part B. I use only that much epoxy because this coat of epoxy is just acting as a sealant for that distressed look, and I just want to put this on the tumbler before I place my decals. Once my tumbler has been epoxied, I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for 4 hours and then allow my tumbler to air dry or air cure for another 20 hours before moving on to the next step. And here's my tumbler after my epoxy has been cured. I take my X-Acto knife again and I trim around the rim of the tumbler to remove any of that excess epoxy around the rim. Once I have my rim cleaned up, I take my 180 grit sanding block and I sand around the tumbler. I'm basically just spot sanding at this point because there's not too many bubbles or bumps around the tumbler. So I take my finger and I feel around the tumbler and I just sand the areas that might need sanded down. The glitter might have poked up, or there might have been a bubble in the epoxy, and I just take my time with this to make sure I have a nice smooth tumbler. And then I take an 80 grit sanding block and I sand around the rim another time just to keep that stainless steel exposed so I can have a nice seal at the very end of my tumbler process. And like I said before, every time you sand, you always want to follow it up with wiping down your tumbler and those areas you sanded with some 91% alcohol. And now for another fun part. I am going to bring this tumbler to life. I first place my tumbler on my craft towel so my tumbler does not roll around, and I'm adding some decals to the tumbler. These decals are UV DTF decals, direct to film decals. I have my Stay Wild sunflower, and then I have my 16-ounce cup wraps sunflowers. All of these decals that you see in this video can be found on my website, mskisskreations.com. I do sell UV DTF decals and 16-ounce tumbler wraps. All you do is replace the backing, place your decal on your tumbler as straight as you can, apply a lot of pressure with a squeegee tool or your fingers. Make sure you are pressing down very hard for this step. You want to make sure your decal is very adhered to your tumbler. So I take my time with my squeegee tool and I really apply the pressure to all of the areas of that decal. Anywhere you see print is where you want to apply your pressure. Once you're finished applying your pressure, you take your finger or a tool and you peel off that backing that's on top of that decal very slowly at an angle, and you want to make sure that decal is very stuck to the tumbler. And then you're left with a very beautiful decal. You don't have to worry about printing, and it's just placed on the tumbler, easy as that. Then I take my Sunflower's 16-ounce cup wrap and I cut my decal into pieces so I can place these sunflowers around my tumbler. This is why I love these 16-ounce cup wraps. You can not only use them for 16-ounce cups, you can also cut them down and place them on any size tumbler and any surface. These 16-ounce cup wraps are also UV DTF decals, so they are placed on the tumbler the same way as how I placed that main decal on the tumbler. You remove the backing, place the adhesive side onto the tumbler, press down with a lot of pressure to make sure the decal is placed on the tumbler, and then you remove that top transfer tape from the decal. I really didn't have an idea of where exactly I was going to place these sunflowers. I just wanted to place them randomly around my tumbler. Although these decals complemented each other well, on the main decal they had two different type of sunflowers and it was really bugging me for some reason. So I took a couple of my cup wrap decals for the sunflowers and I placed them right over those two sunflowers that was on the main decal. And I'm really glad that I did this because they just went really well with everything and you couldn't even notice that those decals were a completely separate decal from the Stay Wild sunflower. They just blended so perfectly. And for the bottom of my tumbler, I really didn't want it to be bare and just add my label. I wanted to have those sunflowers kind of coming out of my label. So I placed my sunflowers in a circle basically, and I like clumped them all together. And I had to really play with it, but I just wanted my sunflowers around my label. And I thought it turned out really cool. It took me a long time to even think about what the heck I was doing, but I had a lot of scrap pieces from my cup wrap that were like half sunflowers, so I thought it'd be really cool if I just took most of the half sunflowers and what I really had left over and just make a cool design. So I hope at the end you like what I did and maybe use that in the future. And once my decals are placed on the tumbler, I take my urethane sealer. This is Quick Coat from CC DIY. This allows those decals to really adhere to the tumbler. So when I place my epoxy on this tumbler, I don't have to worry about my decals lifting. So I place this all over the areas where I place my decal, including the Stay Wild sunflower, all of the sunflower decals, and then the bottom of the tumbler. I've seen some people not seal their UV DTF decals and not have a problem with it, but I've had such bad experience with a lot of decals and vinyl lifting in the past that I'm forever going to seal my decals with this sealer no matter what. Even if it says that you never have to seal your decals, I'm still going to seal it because it's something I've always done just in case, and there's nothing like a decal lifting through epoxy and messing up your entire tumbler and having to sand it and then re-epoxy. This urethane sealer takes about 25 minutes to dry. Once that's dry, we can start adding our first coat of our final coats of epoxy to the tumbler. For my last two coats of epoxy, I am using about 15 to 20 mLs of epoxy for the first coat. You'll see that I have a lot of epoxy in this cup. It's because I do a lot of epoxy at once. So I epoxy a lot of tumblers at one time just because of time management. So the first coat of epoxy I place on the tumbler, it's about 20 mLs of epoxy. It's a lot of epoxy, I'm not going to lie, but I really want those decals to be coated on that tumbler. So I added a thicker coat of epoxy. So that's 10 mLs part A and 10 mLs part B, totaling 20 mLs of epoxy. Once this coat was dried and cured, I went in my X-Acto knife, I cleaned up the rim, I sanded where I needed to sand with a 220 grit sanding block, and then I went in with my last coat of epoxy. My last coat of epoxy was only 10 mLs of epoxy. That's 5 mLs part A and 5 mLs part B. The reason why I only chose 10 mLs of epoxy to do the last coat is because you don't want those thick coats on your tumbler. You want to use that last coat for just that shine and just make sure you just have everything locked into place and you're just making sure your tumbler is smooth. You always want to place at least 2 coats of epoxy for your final coats of epoxy just to make sure you have your entire tumbler locked into place. Now that I have both of my coats of epoxy on my tumbler, I take my X-Acto knife and I cut around the rim one last time, removing any of that excess epoxy that may have been cured on the rim. Once I'm finished with this, I clean my tumbler out with some Dawn dish soap and my tumbler is ready to go. Let me show you the final result. And here is my tumbler. Look how gorgeous this tumbler is, not only from that epoxy shine from Flint Sister Supply Shop, but the colors that I chose for this tumbler with the sunflowers, the decal, the glitter, everything is so cute on this tumbler, and it's just so perfect for all year long. I live in Florida, so it's summer 12 months of the year. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and don't forget that I do sell these decals online, and I am trying to grow my decal business, so please, if you don't mind, if you are looking for some decals, to check out my website, mskisskreations.com, to support my tiny business. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.